Imagine a world where everything you've ever been taught about your enemy is a stark, brutal truth. Their savagery, their scarcity, their desperation. Now, imagine a moment where that carefully constructed reality shatters, not with a bang, but with the antiseptic scent of abundance and an almost unimaginable level of care. This isn't just a war story, it's a profound revelation of humanity, stripped bare on the battlefield, where expectations met a reality so foreign, it became a legend whispered amongst the ranks. The year was 1944. The sweltering humidity of the Sunda Islands clung to everything, a constant, oppressive blanket. For Lieutenant Ren Fujiwara and her unit of nurses, every day was a testament to endurance, a grim ballet performed on the razor's edge of survival. Their field hospital, little more than a collection of tattered canvas tents camouflaged beneath a dense canopy of palms, was a sanctuary built on ingenuity and grim necessity. Supplies were critically scarce. Antiseptics were diluted to dangerous levels, bandages were washed and reused until they frayed into uselessness, and the pain-rattling cries of their wounded soldiers often had to be quelled with stoicism rather than morphine, a commodity rarer than gold. Each morning, Ren would meticulously inspect their dwindling stores, her heart heavy with the impossible choices she faced daily: who received the precious few antibiotics, whose infected limb might need amputation because a simple infection could not be contained. Their enemy, the Allied forces, was a faceless behemoth depicted in propaganda as a technologically advanced but morally corrupt machine, equally desperate beneath their gleaming exterior. Ren and her team had internalized the narrative: the Westerners, for all their industrial might, surely faced similar, if not worse, logistical nightmares on these distant fronts. Their own sacrifices, their own suffering, were part of a shared, brutal experience of warfare. This belief system, forged in the crucible of fierce nationalist fervor and reinforced by constant privation, was their shield against despair. They were the proud daughters of the Azure Dragon, serving their emperor with unwavering dedication, making do with nothing, because that was the honorable way. The skirmish near the Sunstone River changed everything. A lightning-fast Allied flanking maneuver overwhelmed their position. Ren, amidst the chaos of shelling and rifle fire, had been tending to a soldier with a grievous abdominal wound when the camp was overrun. She remembered the metallic tang of fear and adrenaline, the shouts in a foreign tongue, and then the abrupt, jarring silence of surrender. They were disarmed, separated, and led away, a small contingent of medical staff, through the dense jungle paths. The air of grim resignation among her nurses was palpable. They expected harsh treatment, perhaps even a brutal end. They certainly expected no comfort, no compassion from the demons they had been taught to despise. Their captors, rough-looking men in unfamiliar uniforms, kept them moving, their faces unreadable. Ren prepared herself for the worst, her mind already cataloging the meager skills she possessed to simply survive whatever awaited them. The journey was arduous, filled with uncertainty, until they finally emerged from the suffocating jungle into an open clearing. Before them stood not a rudimentary field prison, but a meticulously organized tent city. It was vast, sprawling, and eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of generators. This was an American divisional aid station, far more substantial than anything Ren had ever seen. As they were escorted deeper into the compound, a strange, almost alien scent permeated the air, a clean, sharp aroma of disinfectant, coupled with something else, something sweet and clinical. It was then that Ren began to notice the small details, things that chipped away at her ingrained perceptions. The pristine white of the uniforms worn by the American nurses and corpsmen, the almost casual abundance of stretchers, the sturdy, well-maintained medical equipment visible through the open flaps of the larger tents. It was a stark, bewildering contrast to the desperate, resource-starved reality she had just left behind. The initial shock of surrender and the arduous journey through the sweltering jungle dissolved into a dawning, unsettling realization upon their arrival at the Allied compound. This was not the bare-bones, equally desperate facility Ren had anticipated. This was a sprawling, meticulously ordered medical city run by the enemy. As the Japanese nurses were led into a large, clean tent designated for POW processing, Lieutenant Ren Fujiwara's eyes, trained to assess and triage under the most brutal conditions, meticulously scanned every detail. What she saw was an embarrassment of riches that felt almost insulting in its contrast to their own suffering. Boxes upon boxes of medical supplies were stacked neatly against the walls. It wasn't just the quantity, it was the sheer quality and variety that astounded her. Gauze in pristine, unbroken rolls, antiseptic solutions in large, clear glass bottles, rows of gleaming, stainless steel surgical instruments arranged in sterile, purpose-built trays. And then there were the small, glass vials, individually packed and labeled clearly as penicillin, a drug they had only heard whispers of, a mythical cure, almost non-existent for their own wounded. Their captors, rather than mocking their deprivation, seemed to take this abundance for granted. American medics and corpsmen moved with an easy, unhurried confidence, not the constant, desperate frenzy Ren was so familiar with. Their movements suggested not the conservation of the last remaining resource, but the easy access to a limitless supply chain. A young American corpsman, barely older than some of her own fallen soldiers, approached them and offered lukewarm water from a metal canteen. His demeanor was purely professional, devoid of the malice and hatred the propaganda had promised. This was not the enemy she had been prepared for, this was an entirely different species of adversary, one shielded from the brutal scarcity that defined her world. Their first true interaction with this medical abundance came sooner than expected. Akiko, one of Ren's nurses, a quiet woman who had sustained a minor shrapnel wound during the skirmish, began developing a worrying fever. Ren, seeing the telltale signs of infection, braced herself for the inevitable, preparing to use her meager skills and what little remained of her emotional fortitude to comfort her colleague. She knew that in their own camp, this fever would have likely led to a drawn-out, painful decline. Instead, an American doctor, a man with tired eyes but a calm, authoritative voice, approached them. He didn't question or delay, he acted with startling efficiency. Akiko was swiftly moved to a sturdy cot. A quick, thorough examination, a whispered consultation with his staff, and then came the treatment that stunned Ren into utter silence. A fresh, clean, thick bandage replaced her soiled wrap. A shot of penicillin, drawn from a vial as if it were mere tap water, was administered. Akiko was given a full glass of cool water and a small white pill for her fever, something Ren hadn't seen in months. The doctor, using an impromptu interpreter, another captured Allied soldier, patiently explained the course of treatment, ensuring Ren understood, despite the language barrier, that Akiko would recover. Before leaving, he offered Ren a small, unblemished piece of fruit, an orange, a luxury she hadn't seen since before the war began. It was a gesture of simple, almost banal generosity that shattered the propaganda more effectively than any bullet. The realization dawned, the battle they had been fighting was not just one of ideology, but one of entirely unequal resources. The shock of the penicillin and the orange was quickly replaced by the even greater shock of their continued treatment. This wasn't a prison. It was a functioning, highly efficient hospital, albeit one run by the enemy. Their confinement was loose, within the bounds of the medical compound, and what happened next was truly unprecedented. Their medical skills were not dismissed, but actively sought. After a few days of cautious observation and Ren's rigorous demonstration of her dedication to Akiko's swift recovery, an American nursing supervisor, a tall, imposing woman named Eleanor, approached Ren. She had a stern face but a focused, professional bearing. Through a carefully managed interpreter, she explained the situation. The Allied forces, despite their abundant resources, were critically short-staffed due to the sheer volume of casualties from both sides. The field hospital was overwhelmed. She offered Ren and her nurses a stark choice: remain confined, or accept a temporary, supervised assignment to assist in the care of the wounded, specifically their own captured soldiers, who were also being treated within the compound. The terms were clear: they would wear clean, simplified uniforms, without their own insignia, they would carry no weapons, and strict adherence to the American medical protocol was mandatory. Ren felt a torrent of conflicting emotions. Deep-seated nationalism fought against the undeniable, visceral desire to heal her countrymen with the tools they deserved. She looked at the faces of her own captured soldiers now receiving care, faces that were relatively well-fed and steadily recovering, and knew there was only one choice. Healing superseded hatred. Their old uniforms were exchanged, and they were assigned duties. The subsequent days were a whirlwind of activity, a baptism by fire into the world of American medical efficiency. Ren found herself working alongside American nurses and corpsmen, her skilled hands finally able to utilize proper equipment and an almost limitless supply of medication. She witnessed procedures that had been purely theoretical in her own training, plasma transfusions administered as a matter of routine, complex surgeries performed with precision in mobile operating rooms, and patients recovering from ailments that would have been a death sentence in her own camp. The Americans had dedicated recovery tents, a steady supply of nutritious, standardized food for every patient, and even rudimentary forms of physical rehabilitation beginning immediately after surgery. Ren was particularly struck by the universal compassion. She watched American doctors agonizing over every patient, regardless of their nationality. They treated the wounded Japanese soldiers with the exact same diligence, respect, and meticulous care as their own men. Ren saw a young Japanese private, whose severely shattered arm she had expected to lose, now on the path to full recovery thanks to advanced orthopedic surgery and a steady supply of antibiotics. The medical abundance wasn't just physical supplies, it was a profound testament to a different kind of operational culture, a shocking generosity and professionalism in the midst of total war. Each sterile bandage wrapped, each painkiller administered, was a direct contradiction to the grim, resource-starved reality she had known. Her world was being irrevocably reshaped, not by the force of arms, but by the quiet power of unimagined medical capability. The captivity was transforming from a punishment into a classroom, and the enemy was teaching them a profound lesson in the ethics of care. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The longer Lieutenant Ren Fujiwara and her nurses worked within the confines of the Allied medical station, the more profound the culture shock became. It wasn't just the sheer quantity of supplies, it was the paradox of the protocol, the fact that this enemy, known for its industrial warfare, applied its industrial efficiency to the meticulous preservation of life. Ren, who had excelled under conditions that demanded harsh triage and acceptance of loss, now struggled to comprehend a system designed to fight for every patient, regardless of the statistical probability of survival. In her camp, if a soldier had extensive burns or a major infection without antibiotics, the focus shifted to easing their passing and conserving resources for those with higher chances. Here, burn victims were treated in specialized, sterile isolation units, their pain managed aggressively with an array of narcotics Ren had only read about, and their wounds dressed with layers of petroleum jelly gauze, a common item here, a fantasy back home. She watched in silent astonishment as an American doctor spent over 3 hours attempting a complex skin graft on a young airman, a procedure that demanded specialized equipment and immense time. In Ren's world, that 3 hours was better spent on 3 simpler cases. But here, time and resources were treated as expandable, not finite. One afternoon, she was assigned to assist in the treatment of a young, severely wounded Japanese soldier named Taro, who had been captured days earlier. Taro had severe shrapnel wounds, but more critically, he was dangerously malnourished, a common affliction among their troops. The American doctor, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Amelia, directed Ren to prepare a special high-protein liquid nutrient. Ren watched Dr. Amelia spend 30 minutes debating with a supply officer over the exact caloric content needed, ensuring Taro received not just enough to survive, but optimal nutrition for recovery. This level of bureaucratic detail applied to a single, enemy soldier's diet was a revelation. It wasn't pity, it was standard procedure. This contrast forced a deep, ethical confrontation within Ren. She began to see the true cost of their own nationalistic pride. Her side had embraced hardship and scarcity as virtues, equating suffering with honor. The Allies, conversely, viewed efficiency and abundance as the highest form of service to their men, and to the universal ideal of healing. They saved lives not despite the war, but with the supreme organization of the war machine. Ren realized that their enemy's ruthlessness was not in their savagery, but in their capacity to provide. The American system was not based on individual heroism and self-sacrifice, but on logistical genius and impersonal compassion, a compassion so universally applied it became horrifyingly effective. During one night shift, a truck arrived carrying fresh casualties. A wounded American sergeant was brought in alongside a wounded Japanese officer. Ren watched as the triage team worked simultaneously, prioritizing based purely on the severity of the wounds, not the insignia on the uniform. The Japanese officer, bleeding profusely from a major artery, was rushed to the operating tent before the American sergeant, whose injury was less immediately life-threatening. This strictly medical, apolitical triage was the final, devastating blow to Ren's ingrained perception. The American system, she concluded, was a giant, efficient machine that didn't hate, it just healed, and in doing so, demonstrated a superiority far more unnerving than any weapon. The paradox was complete: the enemy was not defined by its cruelty, but by its unfathomable capacity for care. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The immediate, practical experience of working with advanced supplies quickly evolved into a painful retrospective analysis for Ren and her team. They were no longer simply treating wounds, they were mentally re-triaging every lost life from their previous months of service. Every clean suture, every dose of antibiotic, felt like a ghost of a life that could have been saved. The American abundance forced them to confront the true, devastating cost of their own nation's resource starvation, a cost measured not in territory lost, but in the precious lives of their comrades. Ren often found herself staring at the endless rows of blood plasma, realizing that the simple lack of a reliable way to treat severe blood loss had accounted for the vast majority of their field fatalities. She remembered a young messenger, Private Kenzo, who had bled out from a treatable limb injury, a death that would have been prevented here with a simple transfusion. The realization was a burning, corrosive guilt. The honorable sacrifice they had been taught to revere was, in many cases, a preventable tragedy caused by systematic failure. The American nurses, surprisingly, did not gloat or highlight the differences. They were matter-of-fact, focusing only on the immediate task. This lack of explicit triumphalism was perhaps the most powerful lesson. The American abundance was so ingrained, so mundane to them, that they didn't even see it as a political tool, it was simply the operating standard. Ren observed how casually the nurses discarded used needles, a practice that in her own camp would have been considered an insane waste. They operated on the assumption of limitless replacement, whereas Ren had been trained on the necessity of total conservation. One particularly jarring event cemented this shift in perspective. A complex, multi-day surgery was scheduled to save the leg of a Japanese infantry captain. The procedure required specialized X-ray equipment, a dedicated surgical team, and multiple rounds of powerful, targeted antibiotics. Before the surgery, Ren found an American medical file left open. It wasn't the captain's file, but a general hospital inventory. Listed were the staggering numbers of drugs, surgical threads, nutritional supplements, and diagnostic tools. The sheer statistical weight of the inventory was crushing. It was a tangible metric of the industrial might that underpinned the humanity of the medical staff. Later that evening, Ren was assigned to transcribe inventory for a supply corpsman. She meticulously counted and logged hundreds of boxes of simple, sterile water for injection, a fundamental solvent they often had to distill in dangerous, makeshift setups. As she tallied the boxes, the corpsman, a kind-faced man named Peter, mentioned offhandedly, "We'll run low if we don't get the next shipment in 2 days. We have to keep at least a 3-week buffer." A 3-week buffer. Ren's unit had considered a 3-day supply a miraculous gift. This throwaway comment underscored the vast gulf between their realities, making the memory of every lost soldier, every resource-starved decision, ache with a new and unbearable weight. She understood then that their defeat was not simply one of courage or skill, but the inability to feed, clothe, arm, and, crucially, medically sustain their fighting force on this scale. The cost of scarcity was absolute failure. The most transformative element of Ren's experience was the unexpected intimacy forged under the pressure of saving lives. Working shoulder to shoulder with their former enemies, Dr. Amelia, Nurse Eleanor, and the countless corpsmen, the differences in ideology and nationality began to recede behind the universal language of medicine. In the operating theater, the only allegiance was to the patient's heartbeat. Ren's skill and fierce dedication were quickly recognized. She was not treated as a captive or a subordinate, but as a valued medical professional. Dr. Amelia relied on her surgical precision, and Nurse Eleanor tasked her with training newly arrived American staff on field dressing techniques she had mastered under fire. This shared, professional respect transcended the prison camp dynamic. The Americans saw a skilled colleague, Ren saw an enemy who respected her ability, not her flag. One rainy evening, while treating a Japanese soldier suffering from severe shock, Ren had a minor, but telling, breakdown. The soldier reminded her of her younger brother. Overwhelmed by the memory and the sudden availability of true help, she broke down in tears of exhaustion and grief. Dr. Amelia, seeing her distress, didn't offer pity or platitudes. Instead, she simply pulled Ren aside, gave her a sterile packet of antiseptic wipes, and ordered her to take a mandatory 30-minute rest break in a clean, quiet storage tent. She didn't question the cause of the tears, she simply recognized the symptoms of medical fatigue and applied the proper protocol. This was the highest form of professional respect, treating her humanity, not her uniform. This incident crystallized the twist of the story. The American medical staff did not win Ren over with kindness or propaganda, but with unwavering professionalism and the simple, undeniable evidence of their commitment to life. They didn't have to convince her their system was better, they let the clean wounds, the lowered fevers, and the recovering soldiers speak for themselves. Their humanity was embedded in their efficiency, a far more potent and disarming weapon than any sermon. Ren's final lesson came from an unlikely source, a shipment of blood pressure cuffs. The Americans had dozens, one for every cot if needed. Ren remembered their own field hospital's single, malfunctioning cuff, a critical piece of diagnostic equipment they had to share and manually calibrate. One morning, Ren found a corpsman meticulously cleaning and calibrating every single cuff on a rolling cart, simply because it was Monday, the day for maintenance. When she asked why such precision was needed on a redundant item, the corpsman said, simply, a measurement that's 1 degree off can lead to a misdiagnosis. We have to trust the tools. This commitment to absolute accuracy and preventative maintenance, even on the most common items, showed Ren the depth of the ethos of abundance. It wasn't just having the supplies, it was the respect for the supplies, and the system that generated them, that created the true difference. Ren realized she had witnessed the establishment of a new standard of humanity, one where the preservation of life was not a desperate struggle, but a function of advanced, meticulous organization. The weeks turned into months. Ren and her team became indispensable, fluent in the American protocols and the logistical rhythm of the compound. The original hatred and suspicion had been replaced by a complicated mix of professional respect, personal admiration, and a lingering, profound sorrow for the lives lost due to their own system's failings. The Americans never preached about their political ideals or their democratic freedoms. Their message was delivered entirely through their actions and their unsurpassed medical capability. The unspoken truth was that a nation that could sustain this level of care, for friend and foe alike, at such great distance, possessed a fundamental power and a system of values that was terrifyingly effective. It was the power not just to destroy, but to overwhelmingly preserve. The climax of Ren's transformation came during a final, unexpected visit. An elderly, high-ranking Japanese general, severely wounded and captured in a separate engagement, was brought to the compound. Ren was asked to assist in his care, primarily to provide comfort and interpretation. The general, a staunch traditionalist, was initially resistant, expecting the worst. He refused food, medicines, and the attention of the American doctors. Ren, using the quiet authority she had developed, spoke to him not as a nurse, but as a witness. She didn't argue ideology, she detailed the medical reality, the triple-dose antibiotics that had saved 3 men from gangrene, the portable oxygen generators that had pulled a lieutenant back from the brink of pneumonia, the nutritional supplements that were steadily rebuilding their soldiers' strength. She explained the concept of proactive medicine, the idea of preventing death through abundance, rather than accepting it through scarcity. The general listened, his expression moving from rigid pride to troubled contemplation. His final surrender to the care was not a sign of physical weakness, but intellectual defeat. The American doctors succeeded not because they won his heart, but because their medical science was unassailably superior. When he finally allowed a transfusion, it was Ren who prepared the needle, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, the general understood that the system that had defeated them was one built on a commitment to life, backed by industrial capacity. The American abundance was the ultimate form of propaganda. It demonstrated that their enemy possessed an economic, logistical, and moral framework robust enough to care for its prisoners better than Ren's own government could care for its frontline troops. This truth was the final, devastating psychological wound of the war for Ren. The capture hadn't just ended her fighting, it had fundamentally rewritten her understanding of national strength, shifting it from one of spiritual resilience to one of organized, material abundance. Her story became the ultimate reversal. The enemy she was taught to hate had, through its own rigorous professionalism, become the unlikely exemplar of humanity. As the war drew to a close, the time for repatriation arrived. The captured nurses were assembled, ready to be returned to their homeland. Ren Fujiwara was no longer the fierce, resource-starved lieutenant who had been captured by the Sunstone River. She carried no material souvenirs, but she carried the indelible memory of abundance and the new standard of care imprinted on her mind. Before their departure, Nurse Eleanor handed Ren a small, professionally bound medical journal. It was written in English, but contained diagrams and protocols for post-operative care, wound management, and, most importantly, inventory control. Eleanor simply said, through the interpreter, "We save everyone we can. You are a help to us. Now you have the tools to help your nation rebuild." It was a gesture of profound professional closure, acknowledging their shared vocation above the conflict. The journey home was long and silent. The contrast between the pristine, well-maintained Allied transport and the broken, scarred landscape of their defeated nation was a painful visual lesson. When they finally arrived, they were greeted not with celebration, but with the grim reality of a defeated power, scarcity, hunger, and devastated infrastructure. Ren and her nurses were debriefed. They were questioned extensively, not about tactical positions or troop movements, but about the American capacity and morale. Ren provided her answers honestly. She didn't speak of political ideologies or of their humanity, she spoke of plasma banks, sterile gauze, high-caloric liquid nutrients, and the unwavering logistical efficiency that allowed one blood pressure cuff to be calibrated every Monday. She reported on a medical system that prioritized life so thoroughly it became a weapon of soft power. Her words were met with a mix of shock, skepticism, and quiet understanding among the debriefing officers. They understood the strategic implications. The defeat was rooted in something deeper than courage. Ren and her colleagues were eventually integrated into the nascent post-war medical infrastructure. They didn't preach or openly criticize the past. Instead, they began to whisper the new standard. In makeshift clinics, they insisted on stricter sterilization protocols, even when supplies were thin. They taught the principle of proactive maintenance. They used their American-taught skills to do more with less, but they also advocated, relentlessly, for the necessity of abundance. Ren's ultimate legacy was subtle. She became an instructor at a new nursing school, her lectures infused with the rigor and efficiency she had learned from her former enemies. She taught not just the art of healing, but the science of logistics as the true foundation of medical care. Her uniform was Japanese, but her method was universal. She never forgot the taste of that single orange, but more importantly, she never forgot the professional standard that allowed it to be given. Her capture by the enemy didn't break her spirit, it equipped her to rebuild the soul of her nation's medical system, one sterile bandage and one meticulously calibrated instrument at a time. The captured nurses returned not as vanquished foes, but as unlikely agents of medical reform, their shock turning into the quiet, powerful blueprint for the future. The physical destruction of the great Japanese battleships, Yamato and Musashi, was final, but the psychological and strategic aftermath of those decisive minutes and hours lingered long after the smoke cleared. Part 9 closes the narrative by focusing on the epilogue, the profound realization that the era of the battleship was over, and the grim legacy left to the survivors and the nation. The sinking of the Yamato, during Operation Tengo in April 1945, was not merely the loss of a ship, it was a devastating national trauma. The colossal vessel, built in utmost secrecy and embodying the nation's faith in overwhelming firepower, was intended to be the ultimate counter to American industrial might. Its loss, primarily to carrier-based aircraft and their relentless torpedo strikes, validated the American strategy and permanently cemented the aircraft carrier as the undisputed queen of the seas. For Japan, the sinking confirmed that individual acts of bravery and even the world's largest guns could not overcome a synchronized, coordinated air assault backed by overwhelming resources. In the years following the war, the wreckage of the two behemoths settled into their final resting places, Yamato in the Philippine Sea and Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea. These wrecks, discovered decades later, became silent, profound testaments to the transition of naval power. The underwater footage of their immense, twisted hulls, riddled with the damage from dozens of torpedoes and bombs, speaks volumes about the futility of their design against the new age of warfare. The massive, compartmented construction that was supposed to make them unsinkable merely extended their agony. For the few thousand survivors, the experience was a haunting mix of profound grief and survivor's guilt. They had witnessed the failure of a national symbol and the drowning of thousands of their comrades, many trapped below decks in compartments that were deliberately sealed to contain the flooding. The final moments of the ships were a horrific battle of man versus water, where the damage control teams, having fought heroically, were ultimately overwhelmed by the sustained, low-level punishment from the American torpedoes. The immense loss of life, over 3,000 men on Yamato alone, etched the sinking into the collective memory as a tragic, beautiful, and ultimately pointless sacrifice. The 4-minute window, the time between detection and the first underwater impact, became a metaphor for the rapid, technological shift in naval warfare. It symbolized the narrow, unforgiving margin for error the Japanese faced against the speed and precision of the American attack doctrine. The era of long-range, gun-based duels was supplanted by a war fought over the horizon, where the only defense against the torpedo was air superiority, something the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer provide. The Musashi's fate at Leyte Gulf, absorbing an almost unimaginable amount of punishment before succumbing, was a heroic but ultimately futile last stand. The ghost of the Yamato, therefore, is not just the wreck below the waves, but the enduring lesson in strategic obsolescence. It represents the final, tragic realization that the future of naval power belonged not to the biggest gun, but to the integrated systems of radar, communication, and carrier-launched torpedo bombers that could deliver a continuous, crippling assault below the waterline. The 4 minutes of frantic maneuvering were a microcosm of the entire Pacific War, a desperate, valiant, and doomed attempt to hold back the tide of technological inevitability. The physical wreckage of the Yamato-class battleships marked the end of an era, but their specter continued to influence naval doctrine long after the war. The lessons learned from those frantic 4-minute windows were internalized by both the defeated and the victorious, shaping the future design of warships and the philosophy of combat. For the American Navy, the sinking of the colossal ships was less a celebration of their own battleships and more a definitive proof of carrier air power as the dominant offensive weapon. The tactical success, concentrating torpedoes on the port side to overwhelm the anti-torpedo system, was meticulously documented and analyzed. This data reinforced the need for layered defenses, centralized air control, and, most importantly, the understanding that a ship's endurance was finite when faced with a sustained, coordinated underwater assault. The fate of the Musashi became a textbook case study in damage control failure due to systematic flooding from multiple, successive hits. Conversely, the failure of the Japanese super battleships fueled a deep, cultural fascination. The Yamato, in particular, transcended its role as a failed military asset and transformed into a powerful cultural myth. It became a tragic symbol of courage, doomed sacrifice, and the romantic failure of old-world honor against overwhelming technological might. This mythological status, cemented by the ship's massive scale and its dramatic, sacrificial final mission, Operation Tengo, ensures its enduring presence in Japanese film, literature, and art, a melancholy legend far larger than its actual wartime success. The legacy of the 4 minutes before the torpedoes struck wasn't just about naval architecture, it was about fire control and intelligence. The Yamato's advanced optical fire control systems proved obsolete against American radar and code-breaking superiority. The Americans knew where the Yamato was, and the Japanese only saw the distant, dark shapes of the attacking aircraft. The ability to coordinate multiple strike waves, guided by superior intelligence, proved that a fleet's effectiveness was determined more by its electronic eyes and ears than by the thickness of its armor. This disparity ushered in the Cold War era of guided missiles, advanced radar, and electronic warfare, all concepts directly influenced by the lessons of its sinking. The final irony lies in the ultimate fate of the battleship concept itself. Though the U.S. Navy resurrected the Iowa-class battleships decades later, they served primarily as missile platforms and for shore bombardment, their massive guns acting as precision artillery, not as primary fleet versus fleet weapons. The age of the Great Armored Leviathan, designed to slug it out with another battleship, was definitively killed by the aerial torpedo and the dive bomber that struck below the waterline. The Yamato remains the ultimate, tragic monument to that lost age, a dream of steel and courage that lasted just a few fatal minutes too long. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.